years. Coming up on the final year in this term, we'll be running for re-election after session this year. And I represent the 41st District in Baltimore City. By last count, the 41st District is the largest majority black district in the city of Baltimore. And that is, it covers a lot of West Baltimore from the northern end, not quite as north as Pleasant Hope and Belvedere, but to a tip of Roland Park through Mount Washington, Park Heights, Pimlico, the home of the Preakness, and then also over neighborhoods like Wabash, Forest Park, Gwen Oak, the golf course, Hillsdale, and then over to Edmonton Village and slightly below. So you can see it's a very, very diverse district, racially and economically. So I'm thankful to be here. I've had a long history of service in the General Assembly. I was in the House of Delegates for many years. I resigned in 2016 and then came into the Senate. I can tell you that I've had a long, torturous history in politics, but it is getting better and better all the time. And a lot of it is because I feel like finally the legislature and in some respects the world is finally catching up.
I gotta say, for those who don't know, many people refer to Senator Jill P. Carter as the people's champion. She has been out there on so many different issues, from illegal arrests in the city of Baltimore, go on down the line. She's been in the middle of the fight for justice in our community. And I'm so privileged because some of my earliest days in ministry, even before pastoring, I was following Jill P. Carter around because I felt like whatever she was doing is probably close to what Jesus would be doing, and I wanted to be like Jesus. And so just stay close to Jill P. Carter. And so thank you so much for being here. Now, State, you are the Senator, you are the Senator of the Year. Did I see that right?
Oh, yeah. So, well, you could call me that, but the Legislative Black Caucus gave me that. It's given me an award for that this year. And I'll briefly speak to that. It's really because of the work around police reform. And so even though we finally passed what is characterized as sweeping reforms, even though we have a lot more to go, it's the best we've ever done up until now. I think the reason for the award is not just the performance this year, but knowing that for at least a decade before it was popular, I was pushing for the reforms. Some of the very same reforms we finally just passed.
The long road, a marathon. Thank you. Yes, right. Let's give it up for Senator Carter for her leadership on that front. That's so very important. And also grateful for a dear brother. Listen, it's funny because I remember when both of us were more on the younger end of the spectrum of like the new young activist organizers in the city of Baltimore. And the more grays I count in my chin, the more I realize life has changed. But the brilliance of Lawrence Grandpre has not. Lawrence, take a moment to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Pastor. My name is Lawrence Grandpre. I'm Director of Research for Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We're a grassroots think tank here in Baltimore. We go by initials LBS. Just so folks are familiar with the organization, we started over a decade now on campus at Towson University. Many of us are born and raised in Baltimore, Baltimore City public school graduates, competed in high school and college policy debate, very competitive, almost like NCAA style, traveling the country, competing against other schools, elite universities. And many folks in that activity go on to work in DC, writing policy and doing research to control the agenda of the nation, and no one was doing anything like that for people like us, poor black folks, so working class black folks. So we've been working in the community for 10 years now, both doing work with youth engagement, youth training, leadership training, so we all coach debate, many of us taught in schools. But the main thing folks might know as far as our legislative advocacy, we've worked on policing reform for many years now, and we've been talking about cannabis, especially myself, for I think maybe 5-6 years now. On the day of the Baltimore uprising, I was actually supposed to give a talk on cannabis reform. I've been in this church before talking about cannabis reform, and it looks like Maryland's finally getting serious about it, and I'm just hopeful to use my research skills to lead us to the best possible outcome on this long overdue policy change.
I think with the leadership of both of you that it won't take long. I was thinking, Lawrence, as you was talking and introducing Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, I remember when y'all would would rightly describe yourselves as a young adult think tank.
Yep.
And I noticed that that was not a part of your.
Oh yeah, very intentionally.
Y'all are grown men now. This is different, and grown women. It's a different situation. But let's start with you, Lawrence, and I'll kick it. Senator started with it, but question of why? Why should marijuana be legalized in your view in the state of Maryland?
That's a great question. One that sometimes is glossed over because I think sometimes folks do have questions and don't always have a clear articulation of what the fundamental argument is. A few basic premises. If the penalty for something is a crime, if the penalty for something is a fine, it's only illegal for the poor. So cannabis has been legal in this country for a very long time, specifically if you are white and if you are affluent. The reality is we have very disparate racial enforcement of these cannabis prohibition laws to the point where places like Baltimore, all over the country, you're seeing 5 to 6 times more arrests and convictions for black people, even though it is a clearly stated fact that black people use and sell drugs at the same rate. So you have that reality. You do have some folks saying there's concern. There's concern that if we legalize cannabis, that it'll just be another drug tossed at our people to basically anesthetize us and to make money off of us and to basically exploit us. I think the reality is, unfortunately, that's happening now. That's the status quo. And if we want to have people to have forms of liberatory, like African-centered addiction treatment, you want to have revenue to actually invest in communities. They don't want to space out and ignore reality. You have to legalize it so that we can actually begin to have a more productive and positive relationship with this potential plant medicine. So I'm not going to say there is no possible downside to cannabis legalization, but the reality is prohibition, throwing people in jail for selling a drug that, honestly, rich white people are about to become millionaires and billionaires selling. That status quo cannot remain. So the reality is, I think that we have to legalize it and give folks a chance to benefit economically, but also take the tax revenue that only comes from legalization and reinvest in communities that have been devastated by the war on drugs.
Senator Carter, let's go to you. Why do you think that marijuana should be legalized? Building on that.
So I think it's inevitable that it's going to be legalized. This has been a discussion for a long time. We are now sitting on the heels of about 21 other states that have already done so. We know that we're still recovering, and with the pandemic and coming out of that, we have a lot of revenue that we need to make up for, we need to create. So that's the motivation from, I would say, state leaders. My motivation, why am I for it? So it took me a while to get here because I wasn't always a big fan of let's just legalize marijuana, much to the chagrin of many of my friends. But the reason it's critically important is, as Lawrence said, it's already legalized or decriminalized for white people. In Baltimore City alone, 96% of all of the arrests are for black people with marijuana. Now, some years ago, the legislature decriminalized it and said 10 grams and under, it's just a fine, it's just a citation. But what has happened is that's just fallen way too short of what we need, because you're still having people stained with criminal convictions, you're still having police using it as a pretext to make an arrest, you're still having police officers claiming that they estimated the amount to be larger than that, and so they're still making these arrests. So it's still happening to black people. Black people are still getting arrested. But moving beyond that, for all of these years, the fake war on drugs has resulted in a scourge on black individuals and black communities in particular, and this is a way out. The idea is we're creating an entire new industry. The only other one we've done in the state of Maryland in my career has been slots and gambling, casino gambling, and with that, we didn't do right by black people. We didn't create an economic engine for black people with that, but this is the first one that, in my opinion, there is no argument against why we need this recovery, why we are entitled to this recovery, because what this means is that these corporations and big business and some small business, but anyway, business interests will now be able to once again capitalize off of us the same way they did when it was illegal, unless we make sure that black people are at the forefront. And how does that work? And we'll talk more about it, but that means that, one, we have to get rid of the criminal convictions that people have for marijuana. We have to make sure that we vacate any sentences or convictions, and we have to make sure that we repair the damage of the criminal record And then we also have to make sure that those very targeted and impacted people are at the very forefront of the efforts to create wealth, entrepreneurship for these people, job opportunities and career opportunities, business opportunities. And then finally, we have to make sure that we invest for the first time in the very communities that have been targeted. And if you want to know what communities are targeted, anybody in Baltimore, just drive through the city. Drive through the city, in every neighborhood you go through, it has multiple abandoned, boarded up houses, in every community that hasn't been invested in. Those are the communities. So we're talking about a great deal of our city that stands to be restored, repaired, once we do this.
I want to get into the equity and racial justice and the reparation piece of this. But your comments, I just want to make sure people didn't, I know we got people watching, we have some people in the room, and I think at some point we'll do some questions and comments a little bit later. So those of you who are watching, go ahead and start typing your questions and comments too. And those in the room, get ready for a little bit later. We'll be doing some Q&A as well. But before we get there, my ear caught the fact that you were talking about decriminalization and in your comments. And when our church, when Sha'Carri Richardson was disqualified from participating in the Olympics this year, I put a sign on our church marquee that said, Sha'Carri Richardson, you are still that girl, #legalize. And people, I posted that sign on our social media pages, and people in the comment section started having debate about legalization versus decriminalization. And it was the first that I heard. I appreciated the debate because it was the first I heard about the distinction between the two. Can y'all talk a little bit about, Senator, can you talk a little about, and then we'll go to you, Lawrence, the difference between decriminalizing marijuana and legalizing it?
Thank you. Well, first, I would argue that decriminalization is something that needs to happen for controlled dangerous substances across the board, drugs more severe than marijuana. And why should that happen? That should happen because people need treatment on demand, and they don't need to be criminalized for addiction to drugs, and that happens far too often in our community. But the reason that we need to legalize marijuana and move beyond just decriminalization is, like we've talked about, because we need the revenue. We need the revenue, we need the revenue, and we need the opportunity. We need the economic opportunities that so we can try to create wealth in our communities for the very people that have been harmed and targeted for decades. And then finally, with that revenue, I want to make it clear, because you didn't speak exactly to this, but I want people to understand that when we talk about legalizing, we're talking about taxation and regulation. And so that does not actually mean that we would say, oh, it's okay for everybody that's running in the Olympics or participating in sports events here or driving a car here to do so while impaired. We'd still be regulating it and say, in this situation, you can't do it. We don't want you flying the plane or driving the car while you're impaired. But what we do want is to create another economic engine for revenue so we can restore communities and individuals.
So decriminalization does not go far enough to address the issues that you just raised. I love what you also said, because I've heard people for years talk about addiction as a public health. When I say years, I'm relatively, maybe 15 or so. It's not been forever. But talk about addiction as a public health issue. And the light bulb that you just helped to turn on in my head was that decriminalization keeps us in the same rut, or at least keeps us closer to the same rut of treating addiction as a crime and not as a public health issue. Lawrence, add to that, decriminalization and legalization.
I think a lot's been said. I'll add a few things. Just to be very clear, decriminalization doesn't mean there's zero criminal punitive component to what happens to you if you're caught with a certain amount of cannabis. It just means that, as the senator said, they're going to go straight to the citation, the fine, as opposed to recommending jail time. Now, what happens if you don't pay that fine? It unleashes a set of collateral consequences where you can then actually still go to jail. And again, especially if you are suffering from poverty, you've just sort of managed to recriminalize poverty. Another thing that popped up in my research, when you decriminalize cannabis, there's a study from Prince George's County, because Maryland has decriminalized cannabis, and we still see this massive disparity in who gets arrested for cannabis. It's still predominantly African American, as the senator said, but it's worse than that. When you decriminalize it, many of the police officers believe, I'm not going to send them to jail, so I'll write them up for things they would have otherwise just confiscated your cannabis and let you go. This is called net widening. We actually widen the net of people who start to engage the criminal legal system. And actually studies have found that decriminalization can sometimes widen the net, bring even more people into the criminal justice system, because cops are like, why not? It's just a citation, I'll write them up. So these are the perverse realities of our criminal legal system, where if you don't fully legalize and do reparations for the war on drugs, you still have the structural inequity that's going to manifest itself in things like what we're talking about today. So I do think it's a really good faith belief that I don't just want to unleash the Walmart of weed upon our black communities, that no one is advocating for that, right? So the reality is, if we have a good legalization bill, it's going to allow us to give people the opportunity to actually benefit, because right now they're just being exploited, because even if you're selling weed, you can't bank that money. You can't turn that into a productive change in your lifestyle, because it's illegal money. So we're giving people productive opportunities to change their lives. They're not always stuck in this cycle where they're continuously exploited.
This is so rich. Listen, I'm ignorant, y'all, so I'm gonna ask all my questions I've ever wanted to ask about this issue. My last one on this before we get to the more equity and reparative angle is, you're talking about there could still be, even with legalization, like you said, flying a plane or those types of things, there's still regulations in place. Would that also connect with like the amounts? Let's say like a cruise ship full of cannabis. Would there still be some consequence or there's regulation? I would imagine. How does that happen?
So that I think that's going to take us into the weeds a little bit, and I'm happy to do that, because I'll tell you why. One of the biggest debates we're going to have in the legislature is about amounts, and should there be a limit on amounts. It's going to come up when we talk about whose sentences, convictions we overturn. Do we want to overturn people that have convictions for selling large amounts or not? My argument is yes, because we're going to let white companies now sell large amounts. And I say white companies because our goal while we're here is to make sure that that doesn't only happen, that we have black people that are able to engage in this industry and participate in a fair way. But if left to the devices of the legislature as they passed medical marijuana, we have no black participation there. So you're letting white companies sell as much as they want to sell. So my argument is I'm against limiting amounts, but when we talk about regulation, there's going to be a process for licensure, for who is allowed to have a license to grow, who's allowed to have a license to sell, to engage in retail. And what is critically important is that we make sure that we have a wide net so that we can get all of the black people who have been targeted individually and in community while it was criminal to now be able to avail themselves of the opportunities to engage in the legal industry. And so I think that we should not limit amounts, but where amounts is going to become important here is to make sure that even small people that don't have a lot of money, that can't afford a license for high volume, that they're still able to somehow participate at a smaller level.
Awesome. So let's pivot. Oh, go ahead, Lawrence.
Just a few things really quickly. Just to be as clear as possible, I always assume that someone like my grandmother is listening, God rest her soul. So just to break it down at a basic level. When you talk about legalizing cannabis, there are certain things that happen that prevent the worst case scenario, again, like the Walmart of weed just flooding the black community. You have to test the cannabis for potency. That some weed have gotten stronger, but right now you don't know because it's all in the street economy. So if you want to actually be able to moderate your dosage of THC, you actually need cannabis to be legalized so that you can actually know what's in each strain that you're buying. So the other thing related to amounts is that we're talking about the distinction between being caught and charged with possession of a controlled substance and being charged with intent to distribute a controlled substance. So possession is just simple possession. You had some weed on you. Now, the question is, at what point do you trigger the elevated sentence of, I think you were selling weed, I think you're a drug trafficker, I'm going to actually send you to jail, as opposed to just give you a citation. This is really important because think about it. Let's say you have a snowstorm. You may have to buy more cannabis to get you through that snowstorm. Let's say you have a couple and you're pooling your money together to get a better deal. You can have people having a substantial amount of cannabis but not intending to sell it. And even when we legalize it, people are going to be doing things like that. So you have to be sure that you're not sweeping up people who are just buying cannabis and assuming that they're drug traffickers, right? So that's going to be a really important component of getting a good legalization bill, that we have a properly set limit on what counts as intent to distribute, because you can get regular people who for one reason or another just happen to have a more than normal amount of cannabis on them, but are not intending to illegally distribute cannabis. Again, the ideal situation is that people who actually want to distribute cannabis will have opportunities to do so legally. But it's very important along with that to not sweep people up who are just having cannabis for personal possession and assuming that they need an enhanced criminal sentence. So these are some of the details that we want people to be very clear about as we go into legislative session.
So when we think about medical marijuana in Maryland, we're talking about those who were able to step forward and take advantage of that opportunity. You're talking about overwhelmingly or entirely white companies were able to step forward. How did that happen? How did it happen that in this state where, 25% African American or somewhere in the neighborhood of that, how did we get to a place where only white companies were able to take advantage of it? What were the hurdles and obstacles to black folk getting in there?
The fees, the licensor fees, the ability to, the land, I would say that, and Lawrence may speak more to this, the ability to have a farm or a place where you were able to actually grow the product in Maryland, because there still are restrictions for interstate travel, interstate commerce, because it's still illegal federally. So have space in Maryland where you can grow it, to have the money to put together the high licensure fee, and then many other obstacles. I think also, I think what we're trying to do here is be ready for the next one, the next opportunity. I don't think that we were ready as a community for this first opportunity. I always say this, I'm not one to absolve myself of responsibility, but this past when I was not in the legislature, I think that the legislation, the law as written, and why it's so important that we get this law right, is it did not provide for any type of mandate for black participation, black entrepreneurship, licensure for small and minority businesses or even individuals. It didn't account for any of that. And so the only people that could avail themselves of it, and what we have to make sure doesn't happen with this next wave, is that only those companies already in the industry are able to move over into the recreational. That's something that the legislation, the law as we write it, has to make sure it accounts for and doesn't only allow that to happen.
Lawrence, do you have some ideas as to what we can do this time to ensure that there's more black participation in this?
Okay, we could talk for an hour on this question alone. But I'll try to be brief. To answer your original question about medical, I wasn't doing extensive research at the time, but fundamentally, the reality is when the state legalizes cannabis, again, cannabis is still federally illegal, so you can't ship cannabis in from Oregon or California. You have to grow it all locally, which means you have to have not just a lot of money, but a lot of access to capital, like loans from banks. Banks don't like to loan on cannabis because they're afraid of the federal illegality of it could roll back on them. So you need to have incredible credit, basically, incredible amounts of wealth already established and an incredible relationship to the small number of banks. The black banks really aren't doing this. The places where black folks have established relationships often aren't the places doing loans for cannabis, because cannabis is seen as pretty risky, and black banks feel like, well, they already add me, so I'm not trying to add more heat by going into the cannabis space. So the reality is a mixture of only very affluent, largely white folks having the money to play in this game, to very specific political connections to folks like the now deceased former leader of the Senate, Mr. Mike Miller, and people who are well connected to different high-ranking people in the Democratic Party, which is able to leverage their political connections. And also, if you are part of this social network, you know people in Oregon, you know people in the states where it's already legal. So you have an incredible leg up on your application to say, I already have someone who has proven they can grow cannabis. Well, guess what? If you go to Oregon, Colorado, a lot of those folks are white. So who are they going to know? Other white people. That's just the way reality works. So you're able to put them on your application and say, I have a proven commodity proven credit and a proven grower to give me technical assistance. And if you're black and you're not in those networks, you're severely out of luck. So the reality is that, move on to your next question. How do you make it better? It's not easy. To be honest, I've researched this pretty extensively. No state has gotten this right. And there's only so much you can do to overcome the things I just talked about. White people having accumulated wealth, and white people knowing other white people that know how to do this. So, and unfortunately, other states have tried explicit racial mandates on licenses. Our American Constitution says that that's a violation of equal protection. So you need to have a criteria that includes things like, do you hire people from zip codes impacted by the war on drugs? Do you have people on your board or in your ownership group that have people impacted by the war on drugs? Do you have other things that are able to account for diversity and actually have those give legitimate, extensive points on your application to be a grower? Because they tried to do that in Maryland. Unfortunately, other things like geographic diversity, which many folks felt was a code for people connected to more rural parts of the states than less black parts of the states, was used as more prominent than some of the things I'm talking about. But you can't just say, we'll give black people the license because white folks will sue, and unfortunately they will win. So it's very important to understand that there are multiple spaces to play in this cannabis game. Everybody's going to the top because they have a vision of us having, the big brass ring being the big cannabis grower. The reality is that may not be the most likely space for regular, everyday black folks to make a legitimate living in this space. My research, and it's not really, the last thing I'll say, my research has shown that, and it's not really on paper, I've had to talk to people, but to do a full-scale cannabis grow, you're looking at, $15 to $50 million in capital.
Wait a minute. You said 15 to 50 million?
Yeah. So when you talk about the top-level big cannabis growers, they may not have it all themselves, but they're accumulating capital at that level, or they're connecting with a multi-state operator who has access to hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars behind them. Those are the folks who can play in that space. Dispensaries, a bit more accessible. I mean, you're looking at 2 to 10 million. That's still a lot of money, right? So if you're talking about someone who's ever been to jail, I don't think they're getting that. And there's only so much we can do about that reality. But there are other things we can do. They're called the ancillary industries, the so-called micro enterprises. You can have, there's gonna be a huge demand for like social spaces where you can consume cannabis, these social consumption spaces. So that's just owning a floor of a warehouse. There are gonna be people that do edibles. There are gonna be people that do small scale grows. There are gonna be people that just own so-called head shops where you sell rolling paper and you sell bongs. You're not even touching the plant, but you can make a lot of money doing that. So we have to be creative about how we understand the economic opportunity in this space, because if we allow the small cadre of black folks who can actually play that game to be the definition of racial equity, we're gonna be putting a lot of eggs in just that one basket. And that's not to say those folks shouldn't have a chance to compete or deserve to win. But the reality is we need a far more diverse and I think bottom-heavy vision of equity, where a lot of folks go to the top of that pyramid and focus there.
Yes.
So we've talked about this extensively, and I completely agree with and support everything that Lawrence said. Even though I know he's brilliant and did all the research and he is my subject matter expert, I am not willing mentally to concede that we can't find a way to play at the highest level. Two, in addition to the ancillary, it's kind of like prime contract, subcontractor. I think we can move out of the place of being a subcontractor and be prime contractors. And I think there are innovative ways to do that, such as partnerships, mentor-protege type partnerships, which the federal government has done before, and those kinds of coming together. You come together, you've got a small business, you've got a small business, you've got a small business, you come together, and as one, you're able to somehow create enough to partner with another company. So I don't want to allow any licenses in the recreational space that are exclusive to rich white people, okay? Or rich black people. This is about us. Those that are targeted. So I think I'm not yet willing to concede that we can't do it there, but we're gonna do it. I wanna do it top to bottom and bottom to top. And I think that we have to go for it. We have to try. Nothing beats a failure but a try.
So in addition to Pastor Brown's brownies, right? So I got my own business on the side. Y'all stay tuned for Pastor Brown's Brownies if this thing passes. I'm gonna be the first pastor in the state of Maryland. It's gonna help get the building fund going here at the church. Pastor Brown's Brownies. So we have that. But what you're saying, Senator, is also coming together. My question, my wondering is, it feels like, and I'm so grateful for us having this conversation now, it also almost to me feels like that kind of coming together with groups who have stuff going would probably also need to happen now. And maybe it already is, I just don't know, that those type of strategic conversations are happening amongst black folk right now, not after session starts and the wheels start rolling, so that we're ready and in position. Y'all would know better. In
Not
terms of,
enough.
not
There
enough.
are some of those conversations. I know that you might have seen this, Lawrence. Like Michael Arrington has started a nonprofit designed to educate and solicit participation in this new industry for black people. So there are things in motion. But I think that even as we're having this conversation, right, it's not enough. Here's why. Once there is legalization and regulation, what about the people who don't know this is going on and they still doing their subculture, backdoor, on the street illegal trade? Like, we need to grab them up and bring them into this fold. We need them to be able to make money legally and stop doing it that way. So that's why education, the education part of this is critically important. You can't create opportunities for people and benefit them if they don't know that they exist.
You make me, Lance, you want to jump in?
To add to what the senator said, it's really serious because I'm not directly connected to the subculture, but I'm close to people who are. And there are folks saying, yeah, the cops don't care right now. We're fine. The reality is that once cannabis is legal and the state is taxing it, because the state doesn't tax medical marijuana, because the argument is you shouldn't tax medicine, and I largely agree with that. But they do tax recreational marijuana. So when you create a recreational industry, as California has shown, you create two powerful interests who have an interest in locking up people in the underground economy. You have the legal cannabis folks who see them as cutting into their profits on sales, and you have the government who wants to push more sales into the mainstream economy because they want that tax revenue, which are not getting off of street sales. So even if, and I don't know if any of these brothers will watch this, some of those folks who know these brothers might, even if you feel like you're fine now doing your street game, there's gonna be more focus on locking you up once we legalize this recreationally. And that's the unfortunate, again, perverse reality that we live in. So it's incredibly important that we create legitimate spaces for folks who are actually in that street economy to either transition into the legal economy, or if they want to do something else, not cannabis related, use the tax revenue from legal cannabis to invest in their community so they can choose what type of entrepreneurship or social enterprise or other things they want to pursue. Because again, we do not want to see those folks being recriminalized because we have a new lobby lobbying to lock them up, which is the recreational cannabis lobby.
One thing that I don't think you've mentioned yet, Lawrence, and it's a part of this, and I already know that this is not your favorite mechanism because it hasn't worked in other places, but I think it's one additional tool that we have to require is for those people that are already in the medical industry to pay hefty fees to be able to create these micro grants to finance small and black-owned businesses and individuals to get into the field. And that is something that's been done, but not to perfection.
Oh, yeah, no, I can talk about that. Illinois is actually an example, sometimes for good and often, I think, for bad, about folks really trying to get it right and oftentimes coming up short. So what Illinois did, and this is important because we're getting into the weeds here a little bit. I know we don't have a ton of time. What you can't do, here's what you can't do. You can't say, we're gonna legalize it, and then we'll figure out the equity stuff later. Because it's called a first mover advantage. If you have the first crack at dominating the industry, you get all your infrastructure up. People know your brand. You can dominate that space, so by the time other folks, black folks, get started, they're competing against you. So that's what you can't do. So what Illinois tried to do is said, look, we already have a medical cannabis space. If you want to transition from medical cannabis to recreational cannabis, that's kind of messed up because y'all got first bite at the apple for the medical stuff. But we don't feel like we can ban you because that's probably illegal. but we're going to make you pay for the privilege of playing in the recreational space. So what they did was they made folks pay a really hefty six-figure application fee and use that money to capitalize investments in social equity startups. And that's really important because, again, you have to get that money on the front end. You have to start incubating small black businesses the second the bill is passed. Because if you wait for the tax revenue to come in, it's too late. They've already dominated the space. So that's good, but here's what folks said, and you gotta watch out because this could happen in Maryland too. A lot of those folks were white. So a lot of those folks who were medical, when they transitioned to recreational, they paid good money to help capitalize the social equity fund, which was useful. But folks looked around and said, hey, all the recreational dispensaries are run by white folks. The same white folks from the medical space. And that's a bad look. But at least Illinois made them pay for the privilege. What might happen in Maryland, if they make it to do it anyway, we need to at least make sure they pay for the chance to do, I'm sorry, Pastor, the BS that we know they want to do, which is the transition to dominate the recreational space the way they did the medical space. So there are no perfect answers to this reality, because this is the reality of racism and racial wealth inequity. But we do have a book of solutions that have been tried elsewhere, and we want to take the best of them and improve on them in Maryland.
I'm curious, you've been talking about social equity funds, you've been talking about taxes that we generated. I'm curious, how do you see that being allocated in a way that really helps black folk? Like how, I mean, because a lot of people, especially if they're watching and they're from Baltimore, we've heard so many different times, like if we just pass this, then the money from this will help to improve the schools or will help to build up our communities. And we see it time and time again that after we fall for it, then the monies don't seem to come in our direction. There's some kind of way where the back door's opened up and that money that's supposed to be for us goes somewhere else. How do you see money really, like for real, helping like black folk in this community, in our community?
All right, so I'll talk about that. That's why I brought up Illinois, because I don't actually consume cannabis. I got into this issue for one thing, the tax revenue. It's hard to fight people for the existing budget of the state of Maryland. But if new money comes in, that's an easier fight to win. So that's why I started looking at this in 2014. So every state has tried to do what they call reparations for the war on drugs. None of them have succeeded. And if I had to give one reason why, it's because there's a fundamental part of the reparations that they don't want to enact. And that is that the people who are aggrieved have to be empowered to choose the mechanism of redress. I'll say it again. The people who are aggrieved have to be empowered themselves to choose the mechanism of redress. That means just throwing money into a community, by definition, cannot be reparations. The community themselves has to be empowered for them to choose who in that community they see as legitimate representatives who they want to see help restore their social fabric, build up their institutions, build up their economy. That's what we're not doing. The example is Illinois. I'll try to be brief. Big state, a lot of tax revenue. They created what was called R3, Restore, Renew, Reinvest. It is seen as a national best practice model for cannabis reinvestment. Few problems. They had political appointees dominate the board of who selected who chose which grants got accepted, and they had 3 returning citizens. But they had no mechanism to make sure those people were actual community representatives. It was honestly just tokenism. So when you look at how they chose who got the grants, this is statewide, they had a bunch of nonprofits speak about best practices, evidence-based practices, public health approaches, so they're basically embedding a bias in the request for proposals, the RFP, for well-established, multi-million-dollar nonprofits that have things like 3 years of audited statements, that already have their 501c3 legal status, and who got the money? They just released the grants. I went over all of them. All the big players, YMCA, YWCA, people doing, really cringe programs like, we're gonna do after-school basketball leagues and call that violence prevention. We're gonna get, scholarships to kids and call that violence prevention. Rick Ross's nonprofit got a grant, and Rick Ross is from California. Everybody knows that. But he got a grant for Chicago. And he got that grant so they could say, we didn't just give money to white people, we gave money to Rick Ross and them. So they used this to cover their butts from the accusation that you just levered. And this is the best of them. And the real thing that got me is that they did invest in localities, but they used class as the metric. So you had 95% white localities getting money from the Cannabis War on Drugs Reparations Fund. Wow. So this is what happens when you centralize the money in a state capital and you allow the political machine of, again, the Democratic Party in Illinois to choose which of their friends connected to the Democratic Party gets the bread. And it's been our determination that as long as you keep that money in the state capital, you subject it to the influences of the state party in control, like the Democrats, to be able to use it as a mechanism to hook up the people they know, hook up the people they like. It's not always nefarious, it's just who you know. And there are people on the ground doing work that you don't know. So our whole thing has been, though it's not perfect, find a mechanism to actually invest money into the localities and have people be able to pressure their city council person and pressure folks at a local level to choose a participatory or democratic mechanism that's to their liking, that they want to kick out that bread. Because if they don't, the mechanism will be chosen at a state level. And I don't think it'll be very difficult for us to have real true leverage on what that mechanism is because of the way state bureaucracy works. So Michigan has a model where they just kick money down to localities, and obviously the localities love it. And we're basically trying to take the Michigan model and improve upon it by having some explicit language about things you should invest in that are focused on social justice, that are explicit that you have to have an ordinance approved by community and the community's influence on the city council or the county council to have a mechanism of who holds the money and how you choose who gets the money that's to the community's liking. Legislation cannot solve all of our fundamental problems. It can create points of leverage, points of opportunity for us to force a political system that fundamentally doesn't want what you just talked about to happen, to actually care about the fundamental need we have for this to go to the grassroots level. So this is, again, I've been talking about this for 7, 8 years. I started not thinking this. I started thinking we should have a big state level racial equity portfolio by experts. And over time, I realized that they use that desire that people like me have to think you can have a beautifully designed policy. They use that to trick you essentially into embracing certain gatekeeping mechanism where they use to basically embed the bias in what looks like social justice language. And that's what we're dealing with in Maryland right now. That's what we're fighting, and that's what we're going to continue to push on.
So I've been around you. Thank you for that, Lawrence. Senator, I've been with you and around you long enough to know that when Lawrence talks about grassroots, that's near and dear to your heart. Being out in communities, knocking on doors. I've seen you talk to anybody and everybody all hours of day, middle of the night, registering people to vote on Greenmount Avenue, going down the line. Been there, done that. I'm curious, when Lawrence talks about, and I love the way you broke that down, Lawrence, about legislation cannot solve all of our problems alone. It creates leverage points, and then having that grassroots piece in place to be able to push that lever now that it's created. We're about 3 months out from the beginning of the session. What does, from the grassroots side of things, what needs to be happening like yesterday in the grassroots organizing arena to even get ready to prepare? Because all too often, I'm gonna just be straight up, all too often, after session starts is when I start seeing all the energy. We gotta get people to come out, and I'm feeling like you so late, because those who have a bigger horse in the race or whatever, they're already at the table with their people organized. I've seen that, right? And so what do you think needs to be happening from the grassroots side of things to really start organizing now, even before the first day of session?
So thanks for that. And I'll tell you, we have a bit of an example, a good example of doing it right last session when it came to police reform, because we had all of the coalitions, all of the organizations, small and large, well-funded and not funded, come together and form one coalition on police reform, agree on 5 pieces of legislation. There were many more that needed to happen, but we got agreement on these are the 5 points we will not relent on. And I think the same thing or similar thing has to happen here. Everything that Lawrence said, we know that those that have been most impacted by the problem are best positioned to come up with the solution. My concern is that we're asking people who have been neglected and cast out of a system to do an awful lot of buying into a system in order to avail themselves of the benefits. I'm worried about that, but I don't think it's impossible, and it's all we got. So we gotta reach out, we gotta have organizations come together, we gotta hit the people on the streets. It's hard. It's not easy at all, but it's possible to do. And there's another part of this too that is interesting, and I'm not sure how it's gonna, Lawrence may have more political intel than I have. I'm in the Senate, but I'm still not an insider. But the House Speaker wants to put this to a voter referendum. The Senate, to my knowledge, wants to pass it straight up this year. My preference, believe it or not, even though I'm all for democracy, I think that's a stall tactic. I want to hurry up and get something rolling soon, and so I think we can put enough points in the legislation to make it passable this year. There's already been polling done across the state of Maryland. Majority of people, overwhelming majority of people, don't think people should be criminalized for marijuana, and a lower number in majority believes it should be legalized. So we got to know. Most people, get it. It's not gonna people are gonna lose elections because this is happening. So I think that's something important. So in answer to your question, the best answer I can come up with is we got to educate people. We got to educate people. We need this is a hard one. We need the pastors. There are two areas, I would say two entities that hit just about everybody in this city: the churches and the pastors, and the liquor stores, right? If we could get education at those levels, we would be doing something.
Let me, real quick, Florence, before you jump in, for anybody in the room as well that has comment or question, the microphone is right to my right. Just make your way to the microphone so that we can hear you loud and clear. And right after Lawrence's comment, we'll come to you.
I know we're running short on time, and I'm just going to try to break it down for folks watching as clearly as I can. So next year is an election year. For years, they were saying they didn't want to put it to a referendum. There's some concern that either because of Larry Hogan still being relatively popular, he may support the Republican for governor. He may even run for a Senate seat. There's concern they want to boost turnout in the November election. So for years after years of saying they don't want this on the ballot, now all of a sudden they want to put it on the ballot. It's a political move. There's a cost to it. However, I want folks to understand the cost. The way they're talking is they want to send basically a very vague thing to the ballot in November 22 and then pass the real bill in the 2023 session. That means that we're not going to get legal cannabis till October 2023 at the earliest. That means you're not going to get relief from the criminal justice reality. You're not going to have any of the benefits of tax revenue until 2023 at the earliest, if we let them do that. So it is much better for us to pass a Senate bill straight up legalization this session, if folks are serious. And at the very least, we have to make sure that whatever they send to the referendum isn't just a placeholder for them just to fill it, the actual text of the law, with whatever vague language that the leadership wants to put into the bill in 2023. So if it's going to go to referendum, I have to have clear equity provisions in it for it to go to referendum, and it shouldn't go to referendum at all, because we're just wasting time, and we need this relief now. Frankly, we need this tax revenue now. So the idea that we will wait a year to put it on the ballot is just political posturing. So folks have to understand people have political incentives for what they're choosing to support and how they're choosing to frame it. And folks should know this and be willing to push folks like Senator Carter and anyone who's willing to push a clean bill flat out this session to pass it now so we actually can get going on this long overdue work as soon as possible.
Not to mention, they could always push the effective date out if they do a referendum. They can say referendum, but it's not going to come until 2028.
Yep.
So we got to watch out for that as well as avoid all phase-ins. We're going to pass this now, but phase in the criminal record vacatur. No, we need it up front.
Question, yes, brother.
Yes, hello. My name is Kevin Dorsey. Senator Carter and Mr. Lawrence, brother, I definitely thank you guys for being here and trying to educate the community on what's really going on. However, I do have a lot of questions. And my first question is to the Senator, where is the Black Caucus position in this? And why aren't they here and promoting, getting out the message to the community?
So I think the Black Caucus is going to do some work around this before session. For the most part, the Black Caucus, to my knowledge, There is no piece of legislation yet that has been embraced. We're working on concepts. You know, what are the things we can all agree on? But I can tell you that the leadership of the Black Caucus, his name is, the president, his name is Delegate Darrell Barnes. He is very, very much in favor of this equity in marijuana. And I'm part of a work group within the Black Caucus that's just like the Black lawyers, and we've been having regular meetings working on this, and this group is embracing the concept, not a bill yet, but what are the areas that we can agree on that must happen. And I can tell you, this is some good news. This is some good news. Just like police reform was relatively good. It was one of the strongest showings I think we've ever had, in my knowledge. The Black Caucus stood strong on, these are the points we're not going to relent on. But that was largely advocate and grassroots pushed, right? So we need that same kind of momentum here. But I think that the Black Caucus, from everybody I've talked to and every meeting I've had, we would never support legalization if we aren't coming with equity at the same time, simultaneously.
Thank you very much. Also, I wanted to ask Senator Carter, where does the Black Caucus stand with the effort by the sister and Honorable State's Attorney, Mrs. Mosley, who refuses to prosecute any marijuana cases? And I know that Mr. Lawrence said earlier in his comment that it's not going to last forever. Eventually, they're going to start prosecuting and chasing, widening the net, as he said. The Black Caucus, I haven't really heard anything with them in supporting or not supporting Sister Mosley in the city, and because she stated that she found it to be completely unfair for the state of Maryland to receive licensing fees for marijuana under the guise of medical marijuana, but they still want to lock Black and brown people up for that marijuana.
So the Black Caucus hasn't taken an official position on the state's attorney for Baltimore's position, but keep in mind, they're a statewide organization representing every jurisdiction. And I'm not surprised they haven't, because there's not a specific piece of legislation that this speaks to necessarily. And I think we're also, and again, I'm not speaking for the whole Black Caucus, but I would also say that the legislative body generally has been in one of incrementalism, that we don't take a broad position such as never none. We take small steps with, we're going to decriminalize this amount and that amount and the other amount. And I would say, though, that on this marijuana issue, we're all going to be for getting rid of the criminal convictions and for making sure that people have opportunity. I know this just based on multiple conversations over many years.
Real quick, definitely support Ms. Mosby's effort on that. To be clear, I believe that applies to possession and not intent to distribute. So my concern is that, I mean, even right now, there probably might be some reticence around intent to distribute, but once the pressure starts coming in, you know, we don't know whether that's going to hold up in terms of how, for example, police do their police work. It's not just weight that goes into intent to distribute. They can say you were looking like you wanted to sell stuff, you had stuff bagged up in a suspicious way. So even if you're below the weight, you can actually still get possession with intent to distribute. So, and unfortunately, again, cops have a lot of money, and sometimes, like, their scales break, and sometimes people do want to just make their numbers. So that pressure starts coming in. And my concern is that, I feel, again, that could be the net widening effect, that over time, the stuff that gets, you know, rolled down to possession now might start being charged as possession with intent to distribute. That's what we've seen in California.
My other question was more economical. The growers and fee, is it the same as the licensing fee for a dispensary? And how many, what's the makeup as far as minority participation as far as in growing, and the minority participation as far as dispensing? I've only seen, well, I've seen several in DC, but I've never seen but one in PG County that was minority owned.
So I'll start, and you can finish, because I don't know, I'm not sure if I know the answers. The fees are different for growers versus dispensaries, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Lawrence, but I would say that in Maryland, there are none. There are no minority-owned. I have met one or two that are participating at the dispenser level, but they have come across so many problems and obstacles and hardships that I don't have confidence that if we don't do anything to change it, they're going to be able to continue to exist in the industry. So I'm going to say it boils down to almost no black participation at all.
Now, you got to remember, brother, real quick, they do play semantic games when we talk about this question. So the original process went through, and then remember, there's black ownership, minority ownership, and then there's majority ownership by a minority. So you can have a black person owning a piece of a cannabis industry, a cannabis grower, and they'll call that minority ownership, but they're not the controlling owner. So there are black folks who have pieces of cannabis growers in the first round, but there, I think, was just one majority owned by a minority in the first round. And they just did a second round of medical cannabis growing. And they're very, very proud of their statistics. I think it was like 60% of them were quote unquote majority minority owned. But what do we know? We know that affirmative action includes white women as minorities.
Exactly.
So we don't actually know the breakdown of who they're talking about when they say majority minority owned. My guess would be majority stake, largely by white women, with smatterings of black folks having pieces of those different growing operations. So this is unfortunately the semantic game we have, where Maryland's, like, the way they report minority ownership includes white women as minorities. So we don't have all the details, but anecdotally, we know that folks struggled to get legitimate consideration of their applications the first time. We know that folks oftentimes essentially get tokenized to have a diversity appearance on the application. So you have like really well-known football players or folks who, you know, have pieces of a grower. But what we're talking about is majority ownership, really by a black person, right? And so majority black ownership of a grower, that's been the struggle. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about legitimate equity in that place.
Maybe last one, brother.
This is for the whole panel, and you can answer this too, Pastor. Senator Carter was saying about as far as getting the information out. And she was saying the church is the key, one of the keys. But what about our black universities and our black radio stations? What participation do you see, what role do you see them playing as far as getting out the message? I mean, you know, they quick to play the Beyonce songs and everything else and promoting this club or that club. But what do we do about being able to have access to our black caucus, you know, black
So I
Democrats?
think that's it's critically important that they participate. I know Lawrence has been on, and I've been on Morgan Station a couple of times talking about this issue, but it's not enough. It's just like church, right? You can't just go one Sunday and hear it. You got to go every Sunday. It's got to be repeated, and still you're a mess on Monday, right? So that's what I'm saying. You can't have one hit. This has to be like a narrative that is a continuing narrative in the community for people to really, for it to resonate. And let's be honest, a lot of the people we talking about are not listening to WEAA. They're not reading the Afro. They are not coming to church, but they might be hitting that liquor store, or at least the proximity of it, because, you know, liquor stores, why do I say that? Because liquor stores are in every neighborhood, right? And they are gathering points oftentimes for people for various reasons. And so I'm saying, like, we gotta, as Lauren said earlier, we gotta find people where they live, meet them where they live, and it's our responsibility as a community to do so.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna go ahead, Pastor, and let you.
Absolutely. I think from an organizer standpoint, I like to think about where black folk already gather, already have some depth of relationship, already have some shared principles, et cetera. And so, you know, I do think about whether it's the church. I'm not seeing organizations, liquor stores being organized to that degree, but hey, you know, it's out there somewhere, I'm sure. But whether it's the church, whether it's sororities, fraternities, whether it's labor. So I like what you said, Lawrence, you talk about, I'm imagining my grandmother, bless her memory. I'm imagining my grandmother. I think if the argument can be framed in such a way or explained in such a way that it hits the ears of somebody like me. I've never smoked. Tell me why I should care. Make the case why somebody like me should care. And if that argument is strong enough, and I think you were touching on some elements of it, like around tax, around economic opportunity, around my cousin and them are locked up, or they have records that can be expunged. Now you start hitting on some of the things that I care about, even if smoking is not something I'm ever going to do, whether y'all legalize it or not. And so, yeah, I think going to where people are organized. What I also know is that by mid to early November, the lull starts to happen. And it's hard to get folks to do anything. And then before you know it, by the time we come out of the holiday lull, it's the first day of the Maryland legislative session. And we're off to the races. I really do think if we're going to organize constituencies to get behind this issue, it has to start now. And I agree with you. You got me thinking about, Senator, you got me thinking about, like, can we launch a new ministry at Pleasant Hope Baptist Church, or a committee where y'all are here every week? Come back, come on. We can start the Just Legalize Already committee, and every single week, learning, studying, calling our circle of influence. You a member of the Masons, you a member of the Kappas, you a Q, you a this, you a that, AKAs, Deltas, and if it hits that piece in our pulse that says, hey, this is not just for those who smoke, this is for our entire community, and here are the reasons why, I think we got a better chance of mobilizing. But like I said, if we wait until early November, you can forget about it, in my experience organizing folks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, man. Man, you a better moderator than I was, man. Thank you for them beautiful questions, man. I appreciate you. We are about to wrap up here now, and I'd like to ask closing remarks for both of you. But yeah, I mean, on that, where I just ended, if you could pick up as part of your closing remarks, imagine the larger, maybe even some elements of the more conservative black community, the respectable black folks, quote unquote, who they're not going to be admitting in public that they smoke. But how would you speak to a larger constituency of black folks who you were trying to get engaged on this issue, who are not going to be those who are partaking? How do you do that? What would you say?
Well, that's a hard question a little bit, but the only thing I can do, he said his grandmother, I can just take it back to the way I used to talk to my mother. And I used to say to her a lot, and very frank talk, like, I know you're old, and I know that you don't agree with this. I know my mother, she would not agree with smoking marijuana. She would say it makes you, what she told me, it makes you lazy, you're not gonna do anything. But mostly what she would say is, you will get a record, and the record will follow you for the rest of your life. And so here we are, right on the cusp of the so-called sweeping police reforms. We're trying to limit that interaction between police and people of color, young black people on our streets. And so once we take this out of the equation, so that it can no longer be used as a pretext for brutality, that's another reason to care. That's another reason to care. Says your grandchild, you don't have to worry about your grandchild coming back and forth to the store and getting beaten up, knocked in the head by a police officer, or shot, or something else. That's a really important part of it. But also, we've destroyed entire generations of people with this fake war on drugs. And I think even older adults at this point can recognize that the bad has outweighed the good, and that we have destroyed communities. We have generations and upon generation of destruction and devastation, and this is one vehicle that we can use to start to recover from some of that. So I think those are the reasons. The issue is not whether you like marijuana or like the smell, right? But you're gonna have that anyway. Right. It's not legal now, and you have it.
Yeah, you still smell it. One, I think it looks like Rakia, so if you can pause for a second, Lawrence. We had a question, that I think, or a comment from online.
Yeah, before we close, I just wanted to make sure that we answered some of our virtual questions. What are your thoughts on the medical program versus the adult use program, and the concern that the medical program will be overlooked?
The medical program will be overlooked? I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. Do you, Lawrence?
I have some ideas. Is there any more?
Yeah, it's a three-part question. Why doesn't the current medical market have a diversity program embedded currently? And how do we diversify the medical marijuana program?
Okay. You want to take it? Or should
I
just-
think we've talked a lot about
Yeah.
that tonight. How we diversify is we make sure that those that have been impacted are specifically educated and solicited to avail themselves to benefit from the entrepreneurship opportunities created by the legal marijuana industry. That's one way we do it. And we also make sure that a criminal record is not a bar to being able to participate in the industry. I think those are two important ways.
Yeah, briefly, we talked a little bit about some of the politics around, Mike Miller, the Democratic Party, picking their favorites in that process. I think there have been some concerns that when you have recreational, it takes some of the supply away from the medical, and people who need it as medicine are concerned that people will just like it or they'll be hurt by that. There have been really strong focus on that in other states. So some people have concerns, but I do think that it's a concern that's been seriously thought about. And the hope is that the barrier for entry in recreational will be lower than it is in medical. Because medical, you're making medicine. It's got to be tested. You can sometimes have stronger products in the medical space than you can have in the recreational space. So they're more expensive, they're more complex. So the idea is that with simpler products in the recreational space and a new round of learning from the mistakes of the medical space, that we will still have a medical cannabis economy post-legalization. We can try to improve diversity there, but this recreational space has a lower barrier of entry. So folks who weren't able to access that medical money can access the recreational cannabis opportunity.
And how do we ensure that a majority of the equitable opportunities aren't primarily given to white women?
Given to who?
White women.
Or not given to white women, I'm assuming.
Separate the goals is a concept from, the contracting industry, that you don't just say minority in one umbrella, it's specific minorities. And we know, first of all, we know that there is no argument that black people in Baltimore City have been primarily impacted by the illegal drug trade and by the fake war on drugs.
Yeah, I was on a webinar where one of the people on the Medical Cannabis Commission said it's Maryland law that they report that way. So it sounds like we should just change that. Like we should eliminate the custom of reporting MBE as this unified conglomerate, because we know they're not. Like the reality of wealth accumulation means that white women, though they've been discriminated against as women, will benefit as white people from inherited wealth. So you have to be able to delineate black folks, working class black folks, working class Latinos, to be able to actually understand what's going on. Because again, the Medical Cannabis Commission is doing a victory lap, talking about the diversity in the medical space right now. And I don't think that's the experience on the ground.
And our final question, can you speak on some specific programs that the revenue from the legalization of marijuana will help fund?
I can't, and that's the point. I cannot, and that's the point, right? The idea is there's this intense desire, what I've seen, to be able to point out exactly what the money's going to go to. I don't know what PG County needs. I don't know what Washington County needs. I don't know what the East Side needs. West Side, right? So the idea is that we need to invest in containers that have capacity, build their capacity, and be able to have people who know, be able to invest in programming that actually reflects the community. A brief example, I'm not saying they're going to get this money, but I today went to a program that does manufacturing of clothing in West Baltimore on North Avenue. Most people don't even know that the Image Center exists. Most people don't even know Mr. Aziz and the work he's been doing over there, So there are things like that where it's just like, you wouldn't know, but the people in the community would, right? Now, things like that probably exist all over the city. And what I'm saying is we should have some mechanism to at least have the opportunity for things like that to get legitimate investment, because that's going to be different than just like another after-school program run by a nonprofit that already runs 20 after-school programs. Not to say that that's not good, but the point of, again, reparations, I think, should be to invest in folks who don't typically get that money, folks who are deeply proximate to the most impacted of the war on drugs.
I'll just quickly add that I agree. We should not be paternalistic in making determinations about where this money should go. The people that are impacted should, and the only earmarking that I'm interested in doing is earmarking by zip code.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Well, our time is running out. Lawrence, give you an opportunity for a final comment. And Senator, you can close us out for final comment.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it coming back to the sanctuary and having this conversation. My name is Lawrence Grandpre. I work with Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. You can find us on social media at LBS Baltimore. On any of your social medias, we're going to have a lot of events coming up. We have our Black Legislative Agenda Day, where we're going to run back this conversation to give more detail in December. We have multiple things coming up. The best way to keep in touch is to sign up for our email newsletter. So you can go to lbsbaltimore.com, sign up for our email newsletter, and keep track of all the things that we're working on. We really appreciate it.
I want to thank you, Lawrence, for all your work and research on this over the years and for being such an asset to me and other people that are trying to navigate through this process. I also want to thank you for being one of the only people on the planet that talks faster than I do. I'm slowing it down. I've learned to slow it down just a little bit. Thanks to everybody that stuck with us tonight and listened and watched, and I really hope that you'll stay engaged. I'll continue to post information on my social media, State Senator Jill P. Carter, or Maryland State Senator Jill P. Carter on Facebook, but my favorite social media engine is definitely Twitter, and I'm just Jill P. Carter on Twitter, and on Instagram I'm Jill in the Senate, but Twitter is, I think, where I'm more active. Also follow LBS because I know that they're going to continue to work through this process, and I know that they're also going to work with other organizations in collaboration, and so this is our opportunity. That's all I have to say. This is our shot, right? This is our shot. We don't know when we're going to get another opportunity to create wealth in our community with a whole new legal industry.
Well, I'm Pastor.
And thanks to Pastor Brown.
Absolutely.
Well, I thank both of you. Again, I'm Pastor Heber Brown III. This is the Pleasant Hope Baptist Church. I want it on the record that I am in strong support of the legalization of marijuana in the state of Maryland. And if you are watching this, I don't care if you're Christian or not. If you're not Christian, I don't even care. We need to come together to organize. Certainly my passion is more on the grassroots organizing side of things. We can trust the leadership of those in Annapolis, like Lawrence and the state senator, who've been leading us for so many years on that end. I want to make sure that when that leverage gets created, that our community is in a position to do something. Every congregation, if I can just talk to church folk just for a moment, every pastor watching me knows that every one of your members has been impacted by the war on drugs, quote unquote. Every one of our members has been impacted. We've gone to enough jails, prisons, and graves to see the results and the outcome of the quote-unquote war on drugs, and as quiet as it's kept, many of our members not only utilize cannabis for recreational purposes, but many of the seniors in our churches are using the creams for that old friend named Arthur. You know arthritis. It's in our congregation. It's already happening. I am excited about the shot that we have, and I want to encourage every church, every pastor, every fraternity, every sorority, anywhere where black folk are street organizations, Black Guerrilla Family, the Crips, the Bloods, the Crews, I don't care, wherever black folk are organized, this is our opportunity and the clock is ticking. Thank you so much for watching tonight's broadcast and program. Continue to follow State Senator Jill P. Carter, continue to follow LBS, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and I pray to see you in church so we can get this work to organize our people to move the ball forward on this issue. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great evening.